Hello everyone, Tom Slater here. Just before we get into the episode, I just want to let you all know that if you're hoping to apply for Spike's internship program, you better get a move on. The applications are closing on Monday the 20th in just a few days' time. So if you want to come and work with us in our London office, be trained up in how to write polemics and help us produce our podcasts for 6 months on this paid scheme, then do just go to spiked-online.com/interns where you can find out more about the internship and how you can apply. That's spiked-online.com/interns, and you've got until Monday. Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked. No Fraser Myers or Ella Whelan this week. We can't find them, but luckily I've been able to find two very esteemed stand-ins who are going to help me navigate what's been another crazy week in British politics. I'm delighted to be joined by Luke Gittos. Luke is a Spike columnist, a lawyer, and the founder of the Freedom Law Clinic. Luke, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks.
And also delighted to be joined by Paul Embery, who is a trade unionist and writer. How you doing, Paul?
Very good, thanks, Tom.
So we're going to discuss the backlash to the Rwanda plan, the Grenfell tragedy 5 years on, Keir Starmer's leadership, and why Glastonbury is so white. So to kick things off, let's talk about the Rwanda plan. It's been the big story of the week. And I think this is probably the week where it stopped really being an argument about immigration in many respects and became an argument about who gets to set immigration policy. So this, of course, is the Tories' flagship immigration policy of sending illegal migrants effectively to the Central African state in order to try and kind of break the business model of the people traffickers going across the English Channel. It was always going to be very contentious. Over the course of the past week, we've had the Prince of Wales, we've had the bishops get involved and air their criticisms, and then, of course, the courts as well. So a load of legal challenges. Originally, the policy seems to clear the High Court and the Supreme Court, but over the course of Tuesday, when this first flight was supposed to go, case after case of individuals being pulled off of the flight, and then this big dramatic intervention from the European Court of Human Rights on Tuesday night, which effectively grounded it. So, Luke, what do you make of all of this? Is this a case of the ECHR overstepping the mark, or as Remainer Twitter have been saying, this is just them doing what their job is, which is to make sure human rights are upheld?
Well, I think we need to start with the gravity of what happened at a democratic level. So, as you mentioned, on Tuesday night, an application was made by lawyers in this country to the Strasbourg court, and a single judge of that court decided that on an interim basis, i.e., without hearing the entire case, this is an interim measure, something which happens before the final disposal of the case. He ordered that effectively the final remaining asylum seekers on this plane shouldn't be removed, and therefore the flight did not take off. And of course, it's worth situating this in the history of legal challenges that this policy has faced. This policy has been challenged relentlessly from its outset. And as you suggest, it's been cleared by the High Court and all the relevant courts in this country. And so what we have is effectively one judge sitting in Strasbourg preventing the inaction of a democratically mandated policy. Whatever you think about the substance of the policy, we can come on to talk about that in a moment. But this policy went through democratic debate, through our Houses of Parliament, it went through our courts, and all the relevant institutions of our democracy approved it. And we also know it has popular support. We know that more people support this policy than don't. So effectively what you have is one judge in the European Court overriding our entire democratic process in quite a significant way. Now, as you suggest, the Remainer Twitterati, as we might call them, and we know who we're talking about when we talk about that particular set. But, they would say, well, look, this is what the court is for. It's to put a kind of restraint on democracy. And actually, that is the whole point of the European Court of Human Rights. It is to put a curve on democratic will. When the court was set up, the founders of the court were very clear that this was intended to prevent a repetition of, the Holocaust and what they saw as the worst excesses of democracy. But of course, we've come a very long way since the mid-20th century. And this is not preventing the Holocaust. This is intervening to prevent a democratically mandated policy from being carried out. And I think a lot of the court's detractors, myself included, will see this as a clear example of how the court fetters the democratic will, and I think it's a problem.
Paul, what was your take on all this?
Well, I mean, Luke's the legal expert, I'm the layman, but looking from a layman's point of view, I found it disturbing for very much the reasons that Luke outlined. I think when you're in a situation where two national courts effectively in this country had said, look, there is no legal reason at this stage to grant interim relief to in response to the injunction, and the flight can go ahead, then when a judge from outside the country steps in at the last minute and says, no, it can't, then I think it does actually raise serious questions about democratic accountability, really. And whatever side of the debate you fall on the Rwanda issue, and obviously, you know, there's a range of views on it, I think that should jolt everybody. I think that should make everybody stop and think, hold on a second, what is the democratic process in this country? We've got a government that was elected with a very decisive majority, not a government I voted for, not a government that I wanted to see. I've got some misgivings about the Rwanda policy myself, but it was elected and it's entitled to implement the policy as far as I can see, certainly without European judges stepping in and saying, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. And I mean, I would be interested to know if on the wider policy, because we know, as I understand it, that the courts here decided that there needs to be a full review of the legalities of the whole Rwanda policy. Now, let's say in, I think, a month's time, whenever that review takes place and the policy is rubber stamped, is it then possible that the European Court of Human Rights steps in again and says, no, you've done your review, but we are still of the view that this policy actually isn't acceptable? Then I think it becomes even more serious. So there are real questions around it.
And it feels like, especially after Brexit, we've had so many, just the attempt to implement Brexit showed up all the kind of anti-democratic aspects of our state, as well as the various kind of legal obligations internationally we have. And it's amazing seeing so many people who are effectively cheering some of the most regressive and anti-democratic parts of our system, cheering the Prince of Wales for behind closed doors, getting involved, cheering on bishops, cheering on judges.
And some, let's be blunt, some Tory or ex-Tory MPs have now become folk heroes on the left. You look at the likes of Michael Heseltine and Rory Stewart and people like that, who normally people on the left would be completely opposed to, but because of their particular view on Brexit and they were part of that kind of Remainer elitist kind of mentality, people on the left have flocked to them and are now treating them as some sort of heroes. That's been interesting to witness, I think.
Now, I remember at one of the People's Vote marches seeing Michael Heseltine get a kind of hero's welcome from the sort of London progressive, activist set. So, but never has it been more clear, at least for a while, that this really is about that democratic question. But Luke, we've already seen Boris Johnson hint at the possibility of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, therefore getting out of the remit of the court. That seems to terrify the certain section of society that we're talking about, the pundit class, the Remainers, all of those kinds of broadcasters. They do paint it, as you suggest, as like we're on the slippery slope then to Nazi Germany if we decide to peel these things back. But I suppose part of it is it's a branding exercise. Who wants to be against human rights? But why should we be concerned, particularly about the European Court and the role it has on hemming in our democratic system?
Well, I think that the human rights laws that we have restrain freedom, and I think they play a role in eroding freedom. And I think the reason for that is, well, an example can illustrate what I'm talking about. Whilst we've lived under the Human Rights Act since the 1998, we've had more and more anti-freedom legislation come into play. And we, I think, as a society, have not had our freedoms protected by human rights legislation. Because really, the only intervention that the European Court can make is when, firstly, someone takes a case actively to that court. And when they take a case to the court, the law they're considering, the charter that underpins the court, the European Convention on Human Rights, says very famously, for example, with respect to free speech, it says that, firstly, free speech is a qualified right, meaning that free speech can be infringed in X, Y, and Z circumstances. And most of the cases aren't actually about what freedom means. They're more about how is it lawful to intervene in freedom against particular freedoms. So the court actually plays a role in defining how states can intervene in freedom. That's largely what its role is, I think. So by getting rid of the Human Rights Act, there is an idea amongst certain members of the commentariat that we would end up in a far less free society. But I think there is a case to be made that the opposite could be true, because we'd have to think very seriously about what these freedoms actually mean. We'd have to have another renewed democratic debate about how free we want our speech to be, about how free we want freedom of conscience to be, and how we actually live in a freer society, how we actually make a freer society. At the moment, the kind of reliance on human rights laws to define these things for us, I think, makes us take freedom less seriously. It's also important to remember that there is no law that could prevent us sliding back to the Holocaust. You know, the law did not. The fact that that these atrocities occur is not because there is not a law preventing them. You know, so getting out of the Human Rights Act would not lead to a slide towards despotism in the way that people imagine. If anything, I think it could lead to a kind of renewed democratic debate about what these freedoms mean, and I think that would be a good thing.
And Paul, on the question of how this is going to play, because obviously the main issue at hand, of course, is the question of who gets to decide, as we'd already talked about. But you can't help but think, especially given the time that, say, the government has had recently, that this, a kind of battle with foreign judges, is going to be something which is going to play to their favour. You know, it's been another clear example of an elected British government wanting to do something, and again, because of this anti-democratic interference, it can't. You've also got a very flat-footed, I think it's fair to say, Labour leadership on this question haven't really wanted to come down one side or the other. They'll call the Rwanda plan unworkable, and that's pretty much as far as it goes. But how do you see this playing out? Do you think it is going to be of a benefit to the government and a problem for Labour, as a lot of people seem to think? I
mean, if I were Boris Johnson, I wouldn't particularly, from a purely kind of strategic point of view, be losing any sleep over what the European Court of Human Rights has done, because it does set up, as you say, a bit of a set-piece battle. You know, the Tories taking on the Eurocrats again, and speaking on behalf of the people. So purely from a politically expedient point of view, it could well play into the Tories' hands. That said, you need to caveat that by saying if in the long run the policy doesn't get off the ground anytime soon, because European judges keep stepping in and keep blocking it, then there does become the question, the Tory government, they'll get pressure from the public, particularly those people who voted for them, particularly people who voted for them because of issues like Brexit and immigration, will unquestionably saying, look, what are you doing about this? You know, are you going to take on these judges? Why aren't we getting the policies that we voted for? So it's potentially, I guess, a double-edged sword in that respect. And just coming back on the broader point that Luke raised, I mean, I wouldn't, I'm not an expert on the European Convention of Human Rights, but I don't think I would lose any sleep if we were not a signatory to it. And the reason I say that is because it's almost as if some people are promoting this idea that without the European Convention of Human Rights, we would almost be some kind of benighted dystopia in this country.
Yeah.
You know, we need this European Convention almost to be civilized. And when you think actually it was here in England that we had things like the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta and habeas corpus and all of these cornerstones of liberty, which were in many respects beacons for the rest of the world to follow. I'm not really in the mood to take lectures from people in terms of, you know, if you're not signatory to this, then you're going to go to hell in a handcart. I think that point needs to be made.
Definitely. So let's move on and talk about a very grim milestone that Britain marked this week. So it was 5 years ago this week that the Grenfell Tower tragedy took place. Again, a fire in one particular flat, quickly ripping through the whole building, claiming 72 lives. Paul, this is something that you've written about yourself. It's something that you've personally very worked on, given the fact that you're a firefighter and a trade unionist and were at the FBU, the Fire Brigades Union at the time. And there's a lot of questions about if we've learned any of the lessons, really, of the Grenfell disaster. It was basically found out very soon after that the problem here was the fact that there had been this external cladding added, which was combustible, which had acted as kind of a kind of chimney through which the fire spread around the building, obvious corner cutting from the various firms who were involved, and just a general indifference, I guess, to the residents there who'd actually also raised some of these concerns. But as someone who's kind of followed this debate over the course of the 5 years, while, if we're being honest, some of us might have been drifting over onto other issues, do you think we're at a place where some of the lessons are being learned at this point?
I'm not sure, to be honest. There has been some pretty horrendous stuff has come out of the public inquiry over recent months. My concern, and the concern of the FBU, is a lot of that stuff is not being reported in the media and not being picked up by people simply because, we're well down the road now in terms of the public inquiry. When it launched, as all public inquiries, when they do launch in a blaze of publicity, and the media is interested for some time. And then after that, especially if it's a long public inquiry, the attention seems to drop off. And I think that's exactly what's happened here. And the problem that has led to, Tom, really, is the people who have been on the witness stand recently, who have been facing really tough questions, quite rightly, because these are the people who did cut corners. And these were the politicians who did deregulate and did allow standards to drop. Those questions and answers are not getting the attention that they merit. And at the beginning of the inquiry, and we argued in the union at the time that the inquiry was back to front, because the phase one of the inquiry was all about what happened on the night, the actions of the firefighters, what they did, what they didn't do. And for months, we were subjected to this spectacle of firefighters on the witness stand being very honest and very brave and recounting their stories and facing forensic questions, not unreasonably, because that's what a public inquiry is there to do. And every mistake by a firefighter or by the fire service was on the front pages of the newspapers. And we argued at the time, look, we should deal with the events in the lead up to the fire. And that should be the phase one of the inquiry. We should be talking about why in an advanced Western city did 72 people die, settle down for the night and die before the morning. What kind of lax regulatory regime allowed lethal cladding to be fixed to a residential tower block, not just Grenfell Tower, but as we discovered, hundreds of other tower blocks as well. Who are the people responsible for that? Why did that happen? Get those people on the witness stand first when the full glare of the media is on them. And then events on the night we can deal with in the second phase of the inquiry. So it's been an eye-opener in the sense of the evidence that's been coming out of the inquiry, which shows just how shoddy some of the contractors were in terms of what they did with the renovation of Grenfell Tower, how some of them, frankly, just lied in order to make more profit. For example, submitting false results for tests in terms of the safety of the cladding. One quote was horse meat being passed off as beef. All of this kind of stuff, and consultants being told to go away when they raise concerns about safety and so on. And what I would say as well, I was saying to Luke a little while ago, that whilst the Grenfell Tower fire was certainly unprecedented, no one had ever seen a fire like that before, it wasn't unforeseen. And certainly the Fire Brigades Union back in 1999, giving evidence to a select committee of MPs, very explicitly raised the issue of cladding on high-rise residential buildings and said, look, this is potentially lethal. It's going to create fire spread around the building. It can go back in through the windows at upper floors, etc. And it was almost chilling reading that again, because that's exactly what played out at Grenfell. And as is often the case, politicians just dismissed the trade union for scaremongering and over-egging it and whatever, and it turned out to be absolutely bang on. So I would just urge people, look at the inquiry, see the evidence coming out, understand the seriousness of what happened. Another thing, for example, is the local authority pushed through austerity-driven cuts in their building control department, which meant that surveyors were left with a mountain of work. So when this kind of stuff is happening, inevitably it's going to raise safety concerns. So it's been a tough 5 years, and it was right that the anniversary was marked, because the people there at Grenfell have still not had justice. They still don't know why what happened to their relatives and loved ones happened in the way that it did. They march silently most months on a silent march where they quietly protest and demand justice, and I'm with them in that, and I think we all should be.
And Luke, it really is striking. I think a lot of people just can't understand why no one has, been arrested even over this so far. I think it's amazing that idiot who burnt that effigy of Grenfell Tower ended up in a prison cell before anyone else did. What do you make of that? I mean, why is it that we're almost incapable of kind of delivering justice in situations like this when, again, from pretty much day one, it was pretty clear cut what had happened? We might not have known all the details, but it was obvious that something, a kind of horrendous act of negligence at least had taken place.
I think it's still unbelievably too early to tell. Corporate liability for criminal offences is very difficult to establish. The question is whether you can prosecute companies, you can prosecute individuals, and that might happen. There's no statute of limitations on this sort of thing. And when the inquiry concludes, it may be that the Crown Prosecution Service take a view that it's proper to bring a criminal case against one person, more than one person, against a company, etc. So I think the courts have done relatively well, actually, in kind of processing the reality here and dealing with what was an incredibly complicated set of circumstances. And I think the inquiry is very slowly playing a role that a public inquiry should play, which is to try and make sure that this never happens again. We've seen public inquiries being called for in all sorts of crazy circumstances over the last 2 decades. And arguably, the role of a public inquiry has become far removed from what they were originally set up to do, which was precisely what the Grenfell inquiry is now doing, which is establishing facts in a clinical and accurate way so that we can then formulate a response which tries to make sure this never happens again. It's worth mentioning the cladding scandal because this is still rumbling on, still very much part of a huge number of people's lives, where leaseholders are effectively living in flats they can't remortgage and they can't sell. And some are even potentially on the hook for huge, unaffordable remedial costs to their own property. Now, that's a scandal. And the government have attempted to remedy this through various grants. Michael Gove recently announcing more money, more pressure being put on freeholders to stump up the cash for these remedial works. But we know that this cladding is still on buildings across the country. And that's had a huge impact on people's lives because they can't move, they can't do anything with the properties that they're in, and technically their properties are worthless. So dealing with that is still a burning question. And one that deserves our attention, really.
Mm-hmm. And just finally on this section, Paul, because one doesn't want to always kind of extrapolate too much from one particular kind of singular tragedy, but at the time and now, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of discussion about what does this mean for society, I guess. Does this say something about the standing of working class people in society, of council tenants, whereby they're not listened to? I mean, the cladding scheme is interesting as well because it was part of this kind of attempt to meet green targets, which again came very much from on high. I'm not suggesting that, the then Environment Secretary has blood on his hands or anything like that. But again, just this idea of social tenants being people who have stuff done to them, not really being consulted. And again, one of the haunting details which came out very closely was how those residents groups had raised a lot of these concerns earlier on. But do you think there is something that we can draw from this, Paul, about just the standing of working class people in modern British society, or is that too much of a stretch, do you think?
No, I don't think it necessarily is too much of a stretch, actually, because I think the truth is that when it comes to the safety of particular communities, working class people are often an afterthought, aren't they? I think people in power will often think, well, who's got the influence to kick back at us if we do something that they don't like? Who's got the power to fund the legal challenge to us? Who's likely to get together and take us through the courts or whatever it may be? Then invariably it's the more affluent sections of society that can do that. And I guess if you're thinking about introducing a policy, whether it's the kind of deregulation and the dilution of safety standards that allowed things like Grenfell Tower to happen, then you would probably think, well, working class people will live with that. They're not going to challenge it. They're not going to get lawyers on the case or go out on the streets, etc. And I think another lesson really to a certain, and I think we do have a bit of a culture of safetyism in this country, and I'm highly critical of it to a certain degree. But equally, I think we have to recognise where health and safety is important, and a bit of red tape is important, actually. And I think what Grenfell Tower showed is that there was a deregulation agenda where people weren't concerned about health and safety in the way that they ought to have been, where people just kind of dismissed a lot of the regulations as red tape and said we can get rid of them. You look at, for example, the part privatisation in the 1980s of local authority building control departments by the Thatcher government, that kind of deregulation stroke privatisation agenda that continued under New Labour and unquestionably led to much of the laxness that we've seen. Combine that with the corner cutting of the contractors and their desire to make as much profit as possible at the expense of safety, which I think demonstrably happened in this case. If you look at what's coming out of the public inquiry, that's not just rhetoric, that is literally what happened in this case. I think those are some of the lessons that we can learn from it. But I think the way in which the Grenfell community have galvanised over the last 5 years and said, actually, we're not going to be forgotten. We're not going to go away. We are going to keep on your case, shows that actually you can't, if you do try and dismiss working class people, if you see them as an afterthought, there's a chance they will come back at you, and good for them.
So let's talk a bit about the Labour Party. So a lot of discussion in British politics in recent weeks has been talking about how dreadfully it's going for Boris Johnson. And of course it is. 40% of his own MPs voted that they didn't have confidence in him just a week ago. And yet conversation this week has turned to the Labour Party again. There was a poll in the Observer last week showing that even though Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer are not particularly trusted by the public, in some best Prime Minister polls, Boris Johnson is still edging it, fascinatingly. You've got a cost of living crisis, the list of scandals goes on and on and on, and yet there's still this sense that Starmer is not quite breaking through and is not really getting over that sense that he's just quite dull and doesn't have much of a vision. Luke, what's your take on this? Why is he struggling so much? Or do you think he is struggling?
I think there was a really illustrative moment today when Starmer ally Wes Streeting has been forced to roll back on his comments on BBC's Question Time in support of the RMT union industrial action. And Wes Streeting's comments were quite guarded and reserved, effectively saying, I can understand why people are voting for industrial action, why the railways are voting for industrial action. And today he's been forced to roll back on that, presumably at the behest of the Starmer leadership. And Starmer himself, the Labour Party abstained on that vote with respect to the RMT's action. The Conservative government mooting this vote to criticise the action, and Labour abstained. And I think a lot of people are wondering, well, if Labour aren't going to get involved in debates like this, what are they for? Because here you have an issue where working class interests are manifesting in a very clear way, and Labour aren't just, they're remaining silent. They're not taking a position. And I think that Keir Starmer is effectively what you have when you have a very competent lawyer transitioning into politics. Because I remember when he took the leadership, everyone was saying how forensic he was. That was the best thing about it. Forensic, clinical. But of course, that's not enough. You need to be able to convince people of a political project. And that's been the glaring hole at the heart of the Starmer leadership since its inception, really. And I think that, the idea in Boris Johnson, you kind of have the opposite of competence, arguably the least competent.
Performative
statesman.
incompetence.
Exactly right. Yeah. Someone who doesn't care about the truth, about facts, but does seem to be able to connect with sentiment and ideas. Very interesting reporting I heard on a podcast this week that Labour tacticians seem to think that criticising Boris, they don't want to attack him too directly because it's come to be seen as attacking Brexit. And I think there's probably some truth in that what Boris has been successful in is embodying Brexit to some extent. Get Brexit done, the sloganeering, all of that sort of stuff has, I think, worked to connect him with Brexit, at least in the mind of the Labour Party and probably also with sections of the public. So Keir Starmer just can't connect with any grand political vision. He has no idea about how he would do things differently. And that's what we've seen throughout the pandemic, what we've seen throughout Ukraine, through all the major moments of Boris's premiership. There has been nothing coming from the Labour Party as to how they would be different. And I think that is part of the problem when you have a lawyer transitioning into politics. A lot of the New Labour leadership were lawyers, but they had an idea about what they would do differently. New Labour was, to some extent, a coherent political project. Here you have someone who believes that he can survive and lead a party based merely on his handling of evidence, his marshalling of facts, and his ability to cross-examine. And I think he's showing himself to fall way short.
No, and I think you definitely got a point about Boris and Brexit. I feel like, again, the opposition to him kind of hands that to him naturally when, as soon as Labour has an uptick in the polls, everyone says, brilliant, we can reverse Brexit. Or you've got a shadow cabinet minister this week letting slip on a Zoom call suggesting that maybe we should go back into the single market. Can't help but feed that. But Paul, what's your take on Keir Starmer? Obviously, you're a lifelong Labour supporter, probably more likely to be diplomatic than me or Luke would. But there was one survey this week where they said that the number one word that comes up when people talk about Keir Starmer is boring. Is he boring, do you think?
I'm a great believer that, as Tony Benn used to say, politics shouldn't be about personalities, it should be about issues. That said, it would be silly to pretend that personality isn't important in politics. It's for voters, it isn't just about substance, it is about image as well. That's undeniable. There's a lack of vision, unquestionably, from the Labour Party. There's a lack of inspiration, a lack of ideas. There's no kind of bold, radical economic vision. They will often talk about having fairer taxes than the Tories, or opposing this particular welfare cut, and all of that is fine. But I think if you're serious about trying to inspire people, you actually need a bold kind of macroeconomic vision. You say, how are we going to reorder this economy? How are we going to shift the wealth and balance of power in this country from rich to poor? What are we going to do to revive our industrial base? What are we going to do to get real wages rising again? What are we going to do to make our economy more competitive, to get productivity up, to get investment up? Seems to be very little on that kind of thing. And I think if you combine that with the fact that the Labour Party, I think, culturally is still a million miles from the very voters it needs to win back, voters across small town Britain, working class Britain, provincial Britain, then I kind of think that whoever was the leader of the Labour Party at the moment, I just don't think it would make a great deal of difference. I mean, it seems to me there's a bit of a lack of talent on the Labour benches. I don't mean that unkindly, but in terms of the people...
In politics in general.
Exactly. I don't think it's just a Labour Party issue. I mean, I was talking to someone recently, if you went back to the 70s and 80s, whether you like the Labour Party or not, you could look at some of the real big hitters on the front bench, the likes of Tony Benn and Michael Foot and Peter Shaw and Dennis Healey, Tony Crosland, Shirley Williams, Barbara Castle, all these people, massive heavyweights in their own right. All of them could have led the Labour Party. Now, I think if you look at the Labour Party front bench, and I've been a Labour Party member for nearly 30 years, I don't know half of the shadow front bench, frankly. I'll say that unashamedly. I just don't know them. I don't feel there's a connection there with ordinary working class communities. I think Labour has got to try and shake off this image of itself as an image that is there with some justification, really, as a party of social activists and student radicals and urban liberals, people living in our fashionable cities and our university towns, a party for the professional and managerial classes, party that looks down on working class Britain. I know Starmer has tried to tackle some of that. He stands in front of a Union Jack when he gives his speeches, fine. He's talking about family, community, nation, fine. But it's going to take more than sound bites. The Labour Party needs a DNA. It needs to change its DNA, frankly. And until it does that, then they're not going to connect, I don't think.
And we've got a few minutes left, but I just want to squeeze in the big topic of this podcast, really, which is, why is Glastonbury so white? It often falls to comedians to ask the questions no one else will. In this case, it was Lenny Henry. He was talking to the Radio Times, I believe. And it just at one point kind of comes out with this point about when he's watching Glastonbury on television, he wonders why the crowd is quite so vanilla. This is a kind of recurring thing, not with Lenny Henry, or not singling him out, where, again, it's some kind of big public event, it's a protest, and there's this question about, why is this crowd so white? There's a kind of recurring feature, it seems like, on BBC News, where they take some sort of leisure pursuit and wonder why it's so white, whether that's
walking in the countryside and stuff like that.
Cycling was another one they flagged up. So, Luke, what do you make of this kind of tendency towards almost like racial bean counting in all situations? What's that?
Well, I notice it only ever applies to specific events. So I remember being on some of the Remainer marches just to have a look at what was going on, and it was the whitest place I've ever been. It was undoubtedly. I mean, I think it's a real shame to look at everything through that lens and to reduce an event like Glastonbury to the fact that most people are there are white. I mean, Glastonbury, you need some commitment to get there. You need money. You need to sit there on the waiting list and try and wrangle your way to get a ticket. So who knows? Maybe it's I genuinely don't know why the majority of people there are white. I mean, it's a diverse lineup this year, it's worth saying. But it's not a kind of culturally homogenous place. It is somewhere where different kinds of music are performed. There's no reason necessarily why the audience should be white. But nonetheless, I think it's slightly ridiculous to reduce these events in this way. And I think it's sad because I also think that, when Lenny Henry says it's interesting, there is something else going on there, which I can't quite characterize. Why is it interesting? What are you saying? Are you suggesting that, the algorithm that selects people for tickets is racist? Are you suggesting that this is some grand, that there is some sociological insight here? I doubt it. I think it's more about, I suppose, making a point for the sake of making the point. And I think when we live in an increasingly racially harmonious society, I would argue, it's sad to see things through that lens.
And Julie Bertram on Spike this week suggested that the reason Glastonbury was so white is just because only smelly white middle class balls want to hang out with other
very
middle
probably
class balls. Probably
true,
quite
very
plausible.
probably true.
But Paul, what's your theory?
Well, exactly that, what Julie said, really, because it's mainly kind of white middle class students from the home counties, isn't it? So, of course, in the same way that if you went to a rap festival, I suppose the demographic would be very different. I just think some people are obsessed with, you talked about bean counters, Tom, and it is almost as if people are seeking in every pursuit, in every public event, in every walk of life, people are seeking some kind of perfect pro rata representation in everything. And if it doesn't fall that way, then there must be something wrong. There must be something structurally wrong. There must be some innate racism or something that we're just not getting. And the truth is, look, some people and people from different backgrounds are interested in things that other people are not particularly interested in, or they might go to events that other people might not particularly want to go to. And I just don't look. I'm a great believer that, of course, you want to break down barriers, and no one should ever be prevented from going to an event or from pursuing something they want to pursue because of their race or whatever. We're all agreed that would be completely unacceptable. But equally, I just don't buy into this kind of social engineering, which says that unless you have got this kind of hyper diverse outcome that people want the whole time, and unless you achieve it, then there's something wrong, and we have to look in the mirror and we have to kind of go in for this self-flagellation every time. I don't buy it, and it needs to be resisted.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.